Sego, everybody. So, week 10 stuff. This one's a bit shorter than usual because half of this week's reading activities, if you've already checked out the instructions for the weekly activities, is kind of you exploring your own topic for the final paper. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the last two slides. First, we'll look at part one of this week's reading activities, which focuses on learning about local communities. And this is something we've been working our way towards from the beginning of the semester. So it's kind of taking back up that kind of arc that we started earlier this semester. So, well, let's start with thinking about where we are, right? You might remember that one of the very first things that happened at the beginning of the semester was talking about land acknowledgements. The very first thing that I had you do was look at the words before all else, which is usually the first thing that happens in traditional gatherings in the nations that compose the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And then, there's a thing of guests on a territory acknowledging where they are. So we talked about land acknowledgements. And we looked at Concordia's land acknowledgement a little bit as part of I think it was week 1 activities. And here's an excerpt from that. And if you remember, you can go back to this site. It's something that I recommend people go look at again and again, even when you're done with this course. Just if you live and work, study in Tiohtià:ke or Montreal, it's something that, there are a lot of points there to keep in mind, not just in the acknowledgement itself, but in the rationale. So this is taken from the rationale, where they break it down sentence by sentence to explain where this information comes from. And then if you scroll down, there's more information about giving these land acknowledgements, how to do it, who should do it, what are the contexts, and so on and so forth, what words to use. So it's something to keep in mind. So this is a link that I recommend everybody keep preciously. So here's an excerpt where they talk about this statement of recognizing the Kanien'kehá:ka people as custodians of these lands. And so they acknowledge here that there are many indigenous peoples, communities, and nations who contributed to the foundation of this place, Tiohtià:ke, and we'll talk about that word in a couple of slides, but more commonly known as Montreal today. But it's very widely supported that Kanien'kehá:ka peoples have a strong presence here, and particularly with the two communities nearby, which is what we're learning about this week, Ganawake and Ganazatake. Also taking into account the oral tradition of the Kanien'kehá:ka nation. That's, we've talked about the oral tradition before and how significant it is in indigenous cultures, including the Kanien'kehá:ka and all the other nations in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So part of Concordia's territorial acknowledgement then is to recognize, as they say here, the role of the Kanien'kehá:ka in protecting and caring for the lands and waters that we share and enjoy today. So this is why I say, it's important to go back and remember this, and to talk about it with, people in your family, your friends, that, if we want to, a lot of you were touched early on in the semester about the tradition of gratefulness, and then more recently with Robin Wall Kimmerer's writing about the economy of abundance and reciprocity, and a lot of you wish that there was more of that gratitude. And this is one way to show gratitude. Like, think about the people who've been taking care of the lands that you benefit from, for millennia, before you've been here. It's thanks to them that we're able to work and study and live here. So, and then there's a word here about that kind of stewardship being a model for how we can kind of collectively respect the natural environment and the community as a whole. And again, this is something that's come up in a lot of your journals, concerns about the environment and taking care of the environment. So this is our starting point here for kind of thinking about, well, okay, what attention are we going to pay to learning about local communities? So here are some words, and I've mentioned this word a few times over the semester, Tiohtià:ke. I'm probably not pronouncing it perfectly, but it's again, this is from the Concordia's land acknowledgements under the third point under rationale. And so they refer to jojage, which is an abbreviation of jian. I haven't pronounced this word out loud before. Deoni jojage, which loosely translates as where the group divided, parted ways. Right? So that's another way that they build in acknowledgement for the important role the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples have played in this area is by using their word in the Kanien'keha language for this place. So local peoples. So we've already learned Haudenosaunee. It's been on almost every other weekly quiz, and so you know this by now. How this is something you previously heard referred to as Iroquois, probably in high school, and includes 6 nations. Previously 5. We learned about the creation of the Confederacy back in week 2 or 3, something like that, and that includes the Kanien'kehá:ka. So here are some links. This is a slide from a PowerPoint that I put together for my colleagues. So these links here are things you've seen before, but I left them there because some of you might want to revisit this. So Kanien'kehá:ka, specifically, again, one of the nations that's part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as Mohawk. Back on the Concordia page, if you scroll to the bottom, there's some discussion there about terms to use, and there's a response there that very clearly states, okay, you hear Mohawk a lot, and some people who are Kanien'kehá:ka themselves will call themselves Mohawk when they're speaking English, and that's kind of like with the word Indian, as we've discussed. It's not a word for non-First Nations or non-Indigenous people to use unless they're talking about, okay, the Indian Act. That's what this document is called, and we're referring to that. But to actually call somebody, refer to somebody with that word would not be appropriate. So here with Mohawk, it's a little bit different because, again, some Kanien'kehá:ka people are okay with it, some aren't, but it's generally a good practice to try to learn the names for people in their own language, especially when you're on a guest on these stolen and unceded lands. So, if you're an English speaker, and I know not all of you have English as a first language, so, but for those of you who have grown up speaking English, you've learned some long words before. You've learned to say at some point in your life, probably encyclopedia. You can learn to say Kanien'kehá:ka, and it's okay that you're not going to get it perfectly. Okay, once I was chairing a panel, and there was somebody from Ganawage there, and I did the land acknowledgement, and I kind of apologized for not, for still having an accent or like not being able to say it perfectly, because these apostrophes and like the colon here, these punctuations in the words in the Kanien'keha language, they're stops. So I've seen it compared somewhere, when you go, uh-oh, like there's a stop there, uh-oh, right? It's similar to that. So I didn't grow up with a language where these sounds exist a lot, and so they're in a lot of words in Kanien'keha, so I try. But anyway, the person from Ganawage who was on this panel said, she's not speaking for all Kanien'kehá:ka people, obviously, but she said that she actually really enjoys people trying to say these words with an accent because it's showing more people actually taking the time to try to learn them. So people will appreciate it a lot if you don't just say, I'll just say Mohawk, it's less complicated. It's kind of like if you have a name that's not English and somebody's like, I'm just going to call you Sue or Bill because it's easier for me. I know some of you have had teachers do that, and it's you shouldn't have to put up with that. So it's a similar thing. So anyway, the term refers to the people and the culture. When you're speaking of the language, it's Kanien'keha, all right, which I think I have either in this slide or it'll come back eventually, and it actually means people of the Flint. So here it is. Kanien'keha is the language used by the Kanien'kehá:ka. So I know sometimes this is, difficult. So people who've grown up in French-speaking or English-speaking cultures, you are a French person and you speak French. You are an English person and you speak English. And even then, right, there's some, because technically if you're French, it's like you're from France. Alright, but often, or if you're English, technically that would mean you were from England, but here in Canada, people will refer to each other as French and English more but like in reference to the language that they speak. So the words wind up being the same. Whereas Ganyenkehaga is the people and the culture, and Ganyenkeha is the language. It's the same thing for a lot of indigenous cultures and languages, where there's a different word for the culture and the people and for the language. So local communities that you'll be learning about this week. Here's a little map. So here we are here. there's our island that a lot of us, well, if you're at Vanier, your college is on here. Some of you work here, some of you live here, or nearby up in Laval or on the South Shore, right? But a lot of you live or at least study on this island. That is when we're not in a pandemic, of course. So some of you are studying from home right now. I think most of you. So Ganawage, Ganazadage are the two nearby Ganyenkehaga communities. So sometimes I know they both start with a K, and sometimes people have a hard time remembering which is which. My trick is to look at the length. So Ganazadage is slightly longer, but it's kind of up next to a town that has a very short name. So it's kind of, whereas Ganawage is shorter, but it's next to the town that has a longer name. That's been my trick. That was my trick earlier when I was trying to kind of remember to distinguish between them. So here I put, so Jojage, we already, I had heard it referred to where the currents meet in the Concordia Land Acknowledgement. It's where the group or the people split. So there are different versions that I've heard there in terms of what it means. So Ganazadage is the community up near Oka. So if you've taken like in history or humanities or other courses, sometimes people still talk about the 1990 standoff. Sometimes you'll hear Oka crisis. A lot of people, including myself, don't like it because it makes it sound like, oh, they're having a crisis, like a little hissy fit, and it's kind of, whereas the standoff or Oka resistance at Oka, I think Amanda Lickers, that's how they said it. And there's still stuff going on there, and I'm hoping this semester that we'll have time to talk about Oka, but also talk about what's going on there today. And this is, we started learning in week 9 about the Indian Act and the band council system that was imposed. The struggles that happened at Oka and that are happening right now actually have a lot to do with that, because often people clash if they're supporting the band council, which is under the thumb of the Canadian government, versus people who support traditional governance systems. There are disagreements there sometimes that are involved in these struggles. And Ganawage is, so if any of you have ever driven across the Mercier Bridge, halfway across the bridge you see a sign, you're in Ganawage. So it's another Ganyenkehaga community, and it's near Chateauguay. So some of you have grown up in towns near these places and maybe have never been there, or sometimes people go, there's a lot of smoke shacks in these communities, so sometimes people go there to buy inexpensive cigarettes and things like that, and unfortunately sometimes that's all they see, right? And they don't see that behind this there are entire communities with families and people doing all kinds of wonderful things to revitalize their cultures and their languages. So in both of these places, in typical summers when we're not having a pandemic, they have powwows, events at which everybody is invited. So if you hear about one of those, I really encourage you to go. So just a quick word on pronunciation. So you can click here when you have this PowerPoint. Again, this is the same page that the Concordia Territorial Acknowledgement. At the very top, you can click on a little recording, and you'll hear a Ganyenkeha speaker say Ganyenkehaga and Jojage. All right, so you can listen to it a few times, get your ear used to it. And from what I've learned, so when you hear these Ks, they're not pronounced K, they're pronounced more like a G. So sometimes, people who don't know will say Kanawake, and it's not Kanawake, it's Ganawake. Alright, so the K's are pronounced like G's. The T is more like a D or J, or, DJ sound, right? So when you have, it's not Tio Tiage, it's Jojage, alright? Again, as I mentioned earlier, when you see colons and apostrophes and stuff within the words, they represent different kinds of glottal stops. right? And so and I think different ones sound differently. Maybe they have different lengths. I haven't studied this, but I think they're distinguished. You can hear, when you get used to it, you can hear a difference between them. And when you have an N inside a word, like if we have a word that starts with an N, like the word for thank you is nyawan, so it's like an N. But when it's at the end of a section of a word, or at the end of a word, it's more nasalized. So ganye, right? It's not ganyen, it's ganye, ganye. So these are things you can practice trying to say. And again, I'm not an expert, right? This is not my language. It's just what I've learned. So local community. So these are the same links that you have in your reading assignment. So, you can learn a bit about Ganawage and the history of Ganawage and a little bit about the history of Ganazadage. This one's longer and it's more like date by date, so it's more segmented. And you can stop at 1881 because we'll come back to this article if we get a chance to talk about the Oka standoff, because it has, after 1881 you start to get into that history, because that page was created to kind of give the background and how this is a much older issue than just 1990. And so I'm just gonna kind of leave this PowerPoint here and go to, so this is the article about Ganawake. It's not very long, and some of it will be familiar because they do refer back to things about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Turo Wampum. And sometimes I'm worried, okay, this is repetition, but you know what, when these things are new, it's actually good to see them reaffirmed, but by different voices and in different contexts. So when you first learned about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Turo Wampum and the Great Law of Peace, or the creation story, it was kind of in the larger Haudenosaunee context, and now to hear it and how locally this is interpreted and applied is interesting. So they refer to it here. They talk a bit about the history of the community itself in terms of location, and then kind of more referring back to some of those values. And then the article about Ganazadage, again, this is from a site that we'll revisit again when we talk about Oka, or if some of you wind up doing your projects. This is one of the suggested links. There's a lot of information here, videos, things like that. And so just here you'll see there's a little intro here, which is important to look at. All right. And then here you have just over time what happened. And you can just go down to 1881 here. After this, it gets more into the 1990 things that led up to the 1990 standoff. So that's essentially your assigned reading for this week. And I'm not going to... Whoops. Give me a sec here. As you'll see in the assignment, what you're being asked to do when you look at these two articles, this is just for each one, take down, say, 4 or 5 point form notes. And I'm not kind of dictating what exactly you need to learn. I just want you to get exposed to some information about these communities, because they're local to where we study and work and live. It's important to know them, and over the next, you've seen in the weekly quizzes, some things come back because these are things you really need to learn. These are going to become things that you're going to be asked to learn. You might notice that in some documents, the accent on the A is like this, and in others it's in the other direction. I've seen it both ways on sites that were created by Ganyangyahaga people. So and 10 years ago or 20 years ago, people weren't using these accents and these punctuations in the word. That's kind of a newer thing to reflect actual pronunciation. So there's a generational thing here. I know some folks who are older and who don't use them. So, I try to out of respect for what's going on now, but even I forget sometimes, and I have to look them up and copy paste them, because I struggle with remembering where all the accents and apostrophes go. But I'm working on that. So all that to say that I'm not putting a bunch of information here about the communities, because I'm leaving it up to you to go kind of pick out points in there that you find interesting, that you can bring to the table and that we can discuss and link up to previous material. So for these last 2 slides, I'm just going to talk a bit about the final project, because the second question in your reading activities this week, in the reading questions, is to start thinking about the final project. So I've already uploaded the written instructions on Leia under assignments and Dropbox, so you've probably already gotten a notification about that. And there's a video narration, so if you have these slides, when you look over these slides, you'll be able to click on this, but it's that video, the link to the video is also in the written instructions. So because it's a complex series of instructions with the different options, I kind of made a video to kind of go over it for those of you who are overwhelmed with a lot of text and like the verbal narration. I'm also going to try to organize maybe on one of our class times on a Monday, maybe in a couple weeks, a Monday that Trevor isn't, my friend Trevor, who I said is going to be a guest speaker some Monday in April, and then so that I'll have a kind of an open drop-in session maybe where people can come and ask questions, because I know there will be questions. I tried to anticipate some of them, but I can't anticipate them all. So what you're going to do then for this week's, and for almost every week from now till the end of starting week 10 till the end of the semester, you'll have, there's, as I've mentioned before, there will be one reading in common, or 2 short articles, or whatever combination of short article, video, blah blah blah, and that we'll all be able to talk about together. So that we're doing something in common, and then you'll always have a chance to kind of do the second question on something that's related to your term project or something you're exploring. So for week 10 then, for question 2, is what you're going to do is, depending on where you're at, some of you have already started thinking about topics, and maybe you already have like some ideas, and maybe some of you kind of want to jump in and start reading, and others of you maybe are just kind of starting to think about it while it's like, oh yeah, this is coming up. So if you're kind of really at the initial stages and you're not sure, look at the instructions, and especially like on page 3 at the top, you have some questions you can ask yourself. So start thinking about some ideas, and maybe if you have a few ideas, this is a chance for you to get feedback, say on the feasibility of an idea or some suggestions. So you can put down 2 or 3 ideas that you have for a topic that you'd like to explore, and elaborate on each one. Just don't list like 3 things, like, okay, Indigenous people in basketball and Indigenous people in music, and like elaborate a little bit, like, oh, I'd like to explore the connection between this and this, you know. So maybe 2 or 3 lines per topic. Just give me a bit of your thought process. So this means that you're going to take the time to kind of look at those. Before you can do this, you need to look at the instructions and maybe look at some of the suggested topics, or think about some of the things that we've learned about this semester that you'd like to explore more. If you already have a pretty good idea, like, yeah, I want to do something like related to Indigenous people and health, or the educational system, or the Oka standoff, or whatever it is, and you already have then you can already just go ahead and jump in and review a potential source. That can be from my suggestions, or maybe one that you found on your own, and just start reading it. If it's a very long one, you can do it in chunks, and just basically give a summary of the source or a part of it. Again, if it's like a big 20-page thing, you don't necessarily need to read it all in one sitting. You can do like a section of it. And anyway, basically give a summary of what you've read, and to start getting feedback to make sure that you get your APA, because that counts on the final project. When you look at the final the instructions for it, you're going to see that APA counts, and it's significant, because if it's done very badly, you're going to lose a lot of points. So every time that you, in the weeks to come, where you're referencing one of your sources, you can already put in your reference list entry. So this is the thing that would go in that reference list. And in the instructions for the final project, I give you some links so that you can see how to do it properly. And depending on the kind of source, if it's a book, if it's an article in a journal, or on the web, or a video, like there are different ways to cite all these things. And so if you want to get feedback to make sure that when you get to the point of the final project, you'll be able to do it right, then stick it in here right away. And that's pretty much it for this week. Trying to kind of go easy on you in a sense, because I know there's been a lot of work recently, and also since we're shifting back gradually to the Wednesday deadline. So week 9 we had it the Friday. This week it's going to be the Thursday, to ease you back towards the Wednesday. So there's a bit less time each week in the next couple of weeks. And as of course, I'm always flexible when people need extensions, so let me know if that's the situation. So this means that for our Wednesday Zoom chat on week 10, people will be able to talk about their topics. It's not going to be really a space for tons of questions about the criteria, but if although I will take those questions, I also want to engage on the things you're learning about the local communities. But also, if some of you already want to kind of share during that session ideas you have, things you've read that you're thinking about working on, then that will be kind of another possible topic for the Zoom discussion on Wednesday. So as always, if you have any questions about any of this, do let me know, and I'll see some of you on Wednesday.